You'll be glad to know, for those of you who don't like history, this will be the last class of the intertestament period of itself. And it's incredible. I looked at it and there really isn't any scripture, because during that period of time there's no scripture was given during the 400 silent years. But what's important to understand, and you'll even know better the next class that I teach, this really lays a foundation to explain how God has worked out events and allowed them to happen to set up a world where the world was ready to choose between Jesus Christ or reject him during the Gospels. And you'll see that if the Lord hadn't allowed some of these events to happen, life might have been going merrily, and in my opinion, a lot of people in Israel would just say, well, okay, you can be the Messiah, that's all right, because they weren't deep in their beliefs, but they wouldn't have fought him, and especially the leadership. But these events are what sets that ground so that God, and I keep saying this, gives a choice. And of course, today we're living in that day very clearly, the choice between Christianity and Christ and anti-Christianity. And I think Israel's being that tool once again. Scott, if you turn to John 8:12, this is sadly the only verse we're going to look at this morning, but we should at least start with a verse of.
Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
Okay. The Lord spoke this not that much, that further in front of Hanukkah, which is in chapter 10. There's a biblical reference to it, but his references to the light of the world are significant. And in a sense, light is very significant, because you'll see in Hanukkah it's one of the key elements, which we didn't bring our menorah. And so I thought it was appropriate, even though the occasion was not the Feast of Dedication. That didn't occur till 2 chapters later. So we're going to go on now. And first thing I want to do is remind you, because this is important, the two opposing groups, religious thinking, I think that's a better term than groups, was between the Hellenizers. That was the goal of making Israel and other nations Greek in their mindsets. So they thought like a Greek, they dressed like a Greek, they worshiped like a Greek, and they talked Greek, all right? And then within Israel was a group that fought that in every way. They were separatists, called the Hasidim, the pious ones. And whenever you see the I am at the end of a Jewish noun, by the way, that's usually plural. That's like RS. So just a little hint for you when you see that occasionally. So keeping that in mind, we need to look at maps. I'm real big on maps. I can't help it, but you've got to see what's happening to get a better understanding. And in this case, we have to remember that the Seleucid Empire, it was a large empire. Okay, and we call it the Seleucid. It's named after King Seleucus. All right, that's where the name comes. But a equally correct name would be Assyrian, not but Syrian Empire. And Syria is right above Israel to the north, and it is today very significant. In fact, I'll be surprised if there isn't a war going right on here soon between the Hezbollah and Israel. That's coming. It's got to come. Okay. To the south was the Ptolemaic kingdom. That's Egypt. All right? And it was a major kingdom. Remember, 4 generals under Alexander the Great divided the Greek Empire into 4, I use the term districts, because they didn't really separate. There were still one empire, but it divided to north-south into 4 groups. This was the Egyptian component. During 320 to 200 BC, Egypt dominated Israel. Now, what you need to understand is when they dominated a country, it didn't mean that they necessarily came in with their troops and crushed opposition, all that. They merely said, we will, unless you give us your annual payment of tribute. So during this period of time, Israel gave money to Egypt as tribute to keep them peaceful. From 198 to 143, the Syrians took over and they got the tribute. And as time would progress, the oppression would grow in addition to the money. So always keep in mind, Israel is right in the middle. If you need to get from the north to Egypt, you had to go through Israel. This is just desert. Jordan is not a lovely land. It's a lot of desert, okay? And just for history's sake, so you understand, the two-state problem existed in the 20s. Jordan was for the Arabs, and Israel was for the Jews. So there already is a state, but Jordan doesn't like Palestinians. This is giving you some modern history, because the Palestinians that came into Jordan tried to overthrow the government. And so the Jordan government says, that's it, get out. And they would refuse to allow any so-called Palestinians to come into Jordan. So anyway, this is crucial. This is like a bridge. In today's world, you see in the news, they're attacking ships down here in the Red Sea. Well, here's the Suez Canal, and that's how ships from up here save an enormous trip by coming through the Suez. So this is a very crucial piece of land, always. Okay. Now, in 198 AD, BC, I'm struggling today here. In 198 BC, in the city or the area of Panaeus, you had a battle between the Syrians and the Egyptians. And you can look at your map. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's Tyre. So you're really at the northern limit of Israel, or the southern limit of what is today Syria, or Lebanon, excuse me. So there was a battle there, an important battle. It's at this point that the Seleucids conquer the Egyptians, drive the Egyptians back to Egypt, and the Seleucids come in to the land of Israel and are very much involved with that land because it's crucial to them, because if Egypt starts rebelling, they got to get there quickly, the Seleucids. So that bridge of land was crucial. During this time for Israel, it was actually a time of prosperity. And now there's a name that you're going to hear, and I have to say, keep it straight, which one? The name is Antiochus. This is Antiochus III. He's ruling the Syrian Empire, and he will rule the Syrian empires. He was ruling in 198. He continued to 175. And we have Antiochus III. He's called Antiochus the Great. These fellows were modest. Just call me the Great, okay? And he comes in here at this battle. That's where he defeats a Ptolemy. That was a family name who was ruling. And that's when things changed in Israel. They got, as I said, a prosperous time for them. Antiochus III is going to have a son, Seleucus IV. And Seleucus gets assassinated shortly after becoming king, after his father is dead. Then comes a fellow named Antiochus IV. Now, whenever I'm referring from now on to Antiochus, this is also Antichous Epiphanies that you've heard of, and I'll probably just say Antiochus. This is the guy that causes all the problems, and is a forerunner or a picture, I believe, of the Antichrist. Now, Antiochus, just so you know, was Greek, all right? Greek blood, but he came primarily from the Syrian area. He recognized that these guys down in Egypt, the Ptolemies of Egypt, were getting buddy-buddy with Rome. And Rome was starting to emerge and become what will be an empire. And so Antiochus says, hold it. If Egypt is going to get too buddy with Rome, Egypt and Rome can come together and conquer Syria and his empire. And like all dictators, the last thing he wants to do is be conquered and thrown out. So he needs to get Egypt under control. So in 171 BC, that's a nice picture of Antiochus. I like that one. He starts going down to Egypt to get it under control, under his dominance. And Egypt at this point was pretty weak, and so they would be more worried about him than Rome back here. So he went down here. To get there, he had to go through Israel. Again, always remember, that's how you get there. You get through Israel. He took his army to Israel first, and in Israel, he looks and he says, hold it, I got another problem here. My problem isn't just the Egyptians. My problems are these Jews, because they won't become Hellenized, the Hasidim type, the pious ones. They're going to fight me, and he believed firmly that if you thought like a Greek, you first of all would follow under his leadership, but second of all, that would make you a greater person. And so when they would conquer areas, Syria would move in and conquer areas, they'd Hellenize it, and the people would become very Greek and say, you know, this is really a good culture, and they start becoming Greek-like, and there's no tensions. Not down here in Israel. There were enough people resisting the Hellenization that he got nervous, because he believed they could create a revolt. And you say, well, it's just this tiny little nation the size of New Jersey. So what? Remember, that's how you get to Egypt, which wasn't a tiny nation and did have wealth. So he has to deal with this. He goes in and he realizes that the Jews were the only people, this is the only group that was conquered by Syria that resisted Hellenism. And it was led by a guy named Onias III. He was the legitimate high priest of Israel. Remember, to be high priest, there were two qualifications you had to have. One, you had to be descended from Zadok, who was high priest under David. And the second is the succession line of high priest was father to firstborn son. If there wasn't a firstborn son, it would go from what would have been a father to his brother to his firstborn, and so on down until they got a firstborn. Had to be firstborn to be high priest. So Onias was totally a legitimate high priest of Zadokian descendancy. Now, just as a reminder, Hellenism, or Hellenizers, was a simulation of Greek culture and dress, religion, that's important, and mindset. As far as the Greeks were concerned, if you had this God of Israel, he was a local god, and he wasn't as powerful as the Greek gods. Remember, they had multi-gods. Hellenism was very important. It was forced upon people, and again, Israel was resisting that. They don't want it. Again, remember this now. To be blessed by God as a nation, Israel required a high priestly succession to go from father to firstborn son. It's the only way you can do it. Well, Antiochus, he had a better solution to stop this resistance of Onias, legitimate high priest. He decided he had to get rid of Onias. Simple. Get rid of your opposition. So Onias's younger brother, Jason, he liked Hellenism, and he liked Antiochus. So he did a simple thing. He went to Antiochus and he said, I'll pay you, Antiochus, if you make me the high priest. I want to be high priest, not my big brother. You know, brothers sometimes have rivalries. Well, these were more serious rivalries than most. So Antiochus looks at the money, says, great, you're the high priest, throw out Onias. At that point, we have a change in history. If you'll remember the line of high priests, Aaron was really the first high priest. He's not called a high priest in the Bible. He serves the function of high priest. From his line, God said, will flow the whole line of priesthood and high priest. Nadab and Abihu, maybe you can remember my little Lego guys video I had where they presented false fire. God did them strange fire. They disobeyed God's rules about sacrifice. They were eliminated. Nadab, he could have become the high priest line, if you will, but he's eliminated. Eleazar, next in line, he becomes the line of high priest. We come to King David's time, and Zadok becomes high priest and stays loyal to David. The other line, through Ithamar, Eli, Abiathar, they challenged Zadok, and God ends their line too. So only one line is moving properly. We come to Onias III. Jason, his brother, pays money. Jason, by the way, was the Greek name for the Hebrew name Joshua. Okay. So at that point, the high priest line shifted over to Jason as far as an official person, but not a legitimate high priest. Okay. And then there will be unknown years between Onias, the last true Zadokian high priest, and the Lord Jesus Christ becomes high priest. Now, things get a little complicated. Antiochus figures he's got things in control. All looks well. He's got the high priest in his power, and we have a bit of a problem here. Antiochus goes down to Egypt. He's going to deal with Egypt. He's going to create a puppet government in Egypt under him. While he's down there, up in Israel, a rumor comes. And the rumor is Antiochus has died in Israel. He's dead. And lo and behold, I got to step back here. Menelaus, he came to Antiochus before he left to go to Egypt, and he said, let's get rid of Jason. I'll pay you more than Jason paid you. And Antiochus says, why not? What's the difference? So he took the money, and Menelaus becomes the high priest. He's not Zadokian either, but he's high priest. And they eject Jason at that point. Now you may wonder, what did Onias do as he was pushed out of office? Well, he dies. But his son, his firstborn son, says, hold it, this isn't right. So he goes, he's called Onias IV, he goes down to Heliopolis in Egypt for refuge. And he builds a Jewish temple for worship. Now think about this. The Samaritans, they built their temple in Gerizim. That was an alternative temple that was functioning in the Lord's day. And Onias IV, the firstborn son who believes he's the rightful high priest, goes to Egypt, builds a Jewish temple himself, and that temple continued through until 73 A.D. That's over 200 years. That was during the time of Jesus Christ also. So in the days of Jesus Christ, there was still a line of high priests in Egypt. There's a temple in Samaria, all claiming to be biblical temples of the God of the Bible, and, if you will, rivals to a certain degree. What happens? If you were in Israel and you were a Hasidim, and you really were loyal, and you felt you had to worship in your temple, you might run down to Egypt. Can you think of anybody else that ran to Egypt for protection, refuge? Who? I can't hear. Got to shout. Yes! Okay, so now we're back in thing. Menelaus is the high priest. Jason is sitting there kind of angry. He's been pushed out. And he understands money. He knows that he didn't have a high enough price to pay to get it. So he's sitting there. Antiochus is down here in Egypt setting up a puppet government. And the rumor comes that Antiochus died. And Jason says, aha, here's my chance. I'll overcome Menelaus. And I'll fight him, literally fight him, with Jason's followers. And he's going to regain the position of high priest. Jason will now be high priest. He's got his own army. The city of Jerusalem is under his control now. And then word comes to Antiochus, hey, they say you're dead up in Israel, and they say that Jason has thrown out Menelaus, who paid you more money. Well, they didn't say that, obviously. And Antiochus says, whoa, I can't allow that, because that's suggesting that Antiochus is not really in control. So Antiochus has got to head back. As he returns to Jerusalem, the city of peace, there's a massive battle. And he defeats Jason and his followers, puts Menelaus back in as high priest, and then Antiochus is angry that somebody would think that if he died, they could take the kingdom. So he goes around and he kills or sells into slavery thousands of Jews in Israel. And he goes into the temple and plunders the treasury and takes it for himself. So he has now attacked Israel. At this point, there's a change in his thinking. These Jews are a headache. Anyway, he's thinking, this is a real problem country. The problem still is they don't think Jewish, they don't think Greek, they think Jewish. If they would think Greek, they'd be all for us, because remember, this area and this area traditionally, from Alexander the Great on, was Greek. So if he could just solve this bridge, he could be in better shape. So he goes on at this point and he persecutes Jews mightily. At this point, his Greek thinking really takes over. Antiochus believes that people, the average Joe, yeah, we don't have any Joes here, so we aren't average. In fact, we're all unique, just like everybody else, right? Think about that. Pastor will say that sometimes. Think about that. We're all unique, just like everybody else. Okay. Antiochus believed that people need a visual God to worship and obey. And if there's a visual God, that visual God can be used to rule people and control them through that visual, I'll say, statue. Okay? All right? So he believed that what they needed was a manifestation of a Greek god, Zeus, the all-powerful Zeus. So he declares himself the incarnation of Zeus. And he assumes the name of Antichous Epiphanies, and that means manifestation, shining forth, or appearing. Okay. Appearing of Christ. That's the same word, epiphanies. Shining forth with one N. Manifestation or appearing. You see, that term was well understood in the ancient world. And so when Titus would have written that Jesus Christ is going to appear, that should click people's minds to say incarnation of God himself. In this case, the true God, not the false God. Okay? Now, Antiochus, he's pretty angry. He's got to get them in control. He's going to do several things. He's going to forbid outward Jewish observances in the land. No more sacrifices are allowed in the land. And you can't own a copy of the Torah. Get the scriptures out of the people's hands, or in this case, typically out of the synagogue's hands, so that people could read them and be taught them. This is the first time that Israel experienced true persecution for its beliefs. You say, well, hold it. Weren't they persecuted under Pharaoh? If you read it carefully in the Exodus, Pharaoh wasn't upset at them going to worship. He was upset because he didn't think they'd come back. And he didn't like the fact that they were isolated. And he feared they could create an uprising in his land. Haman, what did he do when he persecuted Jews? He did it because simply he hated the Jews. There's no indication in the scriptures that it was against their beliefs. It was just hating them as people. So, first time in history that Israel experienced true persecution for its beliefs was really under Antiochus. Antiochus, feeling he's getting it under control in Israel, he's got troops enforcing things. He wants to get stronger and tighten his grip on Egypt. And he goes to Egypt. And guess what he finds in Egypt? The Romans are really starting to influence what's happening. And they have a Roman consul. That's like our ambassador. He, for all purposes, is controlling what was Antiochus' puppet leader. He's now controlling him as Rome's puppet leader. And Antiochus finds himself suddenly in front of the consul. And the consul gives an order, and Antiochus is standing there, and they draw a circle around him. And the consul says, Antiochus, you have a choice. Either you get out of Egypt, or we'll kill you. And you have to make that decision before you step out of that circle. So Antiochus says, he's not stupid. I'll leave. Because most dictators fear their own lives being shortened. And so he jumps out. He runs back to Israel. And you know better than I do, well, I've seen it too, rumors and stories travel faster than people do. And in Israel, they've heard, did you hear what happened to Antiochus? They drew a circle around him. He's a coward. What kind of leader is he? So he's going back to Egypt, and he is angry, really angry. Now, he couldn't defeat the Romans in Egypt. He's been humiliated, and so what has been affected most? It's his pride. And pride is always used of Satan. So Antiochus arrives in Israel on the 25th of Kislev, 167. Now we all know what happens. He's a Gentile. He's angry. He wants revenge. He can't fight the Romans. The Jews are still his headache. So he goes into the temple and defiles the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar, and he had the altar dedicated to Zeus. So he did everything he could to humiliate the Jews and their beliefs. He declared himself the walking, living God in Israel. And he said to the Jews, you now must worship me. Therefore, he prefigured the abomination of desolation of the Antichrist in the tribulation. So we can have a picture to see what will happen in the tribulation. It was a direct attack on Jewish beliefs, on obeying the scriptures, and for Antiochus, It was his one chance to humiliate somebody else instead of himself. And I find that it's very interesting that people always react whenever they're embarrassed in a very negative way. And what scares me, humanly speaking, is that leaders of the world, guess what? They have pride. They react the same way when they're humiliated too. And so you think on a human scale, look what can happen in the world because of that. But in reality, it's a spiritual battle with Satan against God. So I think it prefigured a whole lot of things and very demonstrated very basic principles. Now, for 3 years, events occur in Israel to fight Antiochus's army. There's a family called the Hasmoneans. That's a name to remember because from them will come the Hasmoneans, which will ultimately bring a guy called Herod and others. Okay? This family, the head of the family was Matthias, the father. He was a priest who had several sons. He led an ongoing revolt to free Jerusalem and the temple from Antiochus' control. He says, we're going to get them. We won't allow it. One day, where he is, a situation develops. Antiochus wants a Jew to sacrifice to Antiochus. Wasn't in the temple. I don't believe it was in the temple. I haven't seen that, said that. And Matthias says, don't do it. And the Jew says, look at Antiochus. He's got the power. He'll kill me if I don't. And Matthias says, I'll kill you. And he did. Then Matthias gets killed for doing that. At that point, his son, Judah, steps forward. And Yehuda, as his son, takes the leadership of the revolting army of the Hasmoneans. His name is now called from that point on Yehuda ha-Maccabee. Got to say it right, otherwise it won't come out right. And Maccabee means hammer. So what they did, because of his power after his father took over, they named him Judah the Hammer. So whenever you see the name Maccabee, it means hammer. He was Yehuda ha-Maccabee. And all his family and followers were called the Maccabees, the Hammerers. And they were going to be fighting the armies of Antiochus. Now, I want to move back here. On 25 Kislev in 167, the temple was defiled, the abomination. Now, in history, on the 25th of Kislev, 164, 3 years later, they fight, they conquer Antiochus' forces in Jerusalem, reclaim the temple. Now, the average person says, oh, what a coincidence. I'm not sure whether it was or wasn't. We are now stepping into an area of supposition, not of facts. The events that follow. We know the dates are accurate. So, did God supernaturally empower them to conquer it on the exact day that it had been defiled 3 years later? Perhaps. Okay. But that is the date that Hanukkah is celebrated on, or begun. When they went in to the temple, they cleansed the temple. They had to cleanse it thoroughly because of the Greeks. Following biblical guidelines, the temple was rededicated to the God of the Bible. That included physical and spiritual cleansing. the replacement, they totally replaced the altar, the destruction of the polluted altar to Zeus, and new holy vessels were brought in to replace the ones that Antiochus had stolen and taken away. Okay, so everything was put back together. Now, they needed, and this you probably know the story already, they needed sacred oil to be put in the lamps to be lit to light the temple. That oil could only be prepared by a legitimate high priest. Okay? He's the only one who could do it. As they searched, remember they hadn't really had legitimate high priests for quite a while. As they searched, they found one cruse, little thing of oil, just enough to burn the temple's lightings for one day. And this is where I say we can leave it up to you to think about. Miraculously, that oil lasted for 8 days of the dedication. Therefore, Hanukkah is observed for the full time, symbolic of the 8 days the oil burned as a miracle. Okay. In 40 BC, a 9-branch menorah not only was a symbol for Hanukkah, it became a symbol for Israel, the miracle, and for Judaism, and to this day you'll see 9-branched menorahs. From that time to this day, the Jews observe Hanukkah, which means the Feast of Dedication. So that's the story of Hanukkah.